going to be a April reads video, so I'm going to show you all 6 books that I read in April. There's quite a lot of variety here. I'd say quite a few of these are sort of popular books at the moment or quite easily available. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get into it. So the first book I read was The Midnight Library. This is by Matt Haig. I have read one of his other books before. Didn't particularly love it as much as everyone else did, and I think I should have taken that, and it was sort of the same with this book, unfortunately. This is quite a popular book at the moment. I was really excited for it. It's got a lot of hype around it, and for me, unfortunately, it was only a 3-star review. So this is about a girl called Nora who has what she feels is an awful life. She is about ready to kill herself, so trigger warning for suicide and depression. And she takes these tablets to try and kill herself, and in that moment when she is attempting suicide, she gets transported to this library at midnight, and she is then greeted by her old school library teacher, who basically takes her through this library. She's able to pick out books and see her life if it had gone a different way. So for instance, if she had continued on with swimming as a child, if she had continued with an ex-lover, if she had decided to keep her cat as an indoor cat, and how that sort of changed and affected her life. Like I said, for me, I was really excited. I think the idea of it is great, and I'm not saying it's a bad book. I still gave it 3 stars, but for me, it didn't wow me, whether that be because there is so much hype around it. It just left... It was just missing the mark a little bit for me. I didn't particularly warm to Nora at all, despite, you know, I've been through mental health myself, I still am. I just couldn't warm to her, and I couldn't sympathise for her as much as I wanted to. Obviously the book is unrealistic, but it does make you think, you know, what would have happened if I had carried on those paths. And I think we're all, like, especially if you suffer with anxiety, you often think that, what if I'd said this differently, what if that had happened differently? And now I'm very much in the mindset, or trying to be in the mindset, of everything happens for a reason, and you know, you're not able to change what's happened in the past, but changing your perspective on the future. And I think that's a little bit of what this book touches on. Like I said, it's not an awful book. If it does interest you, I would say, you know, give it a go. But for me, it did miss the mark, and I would now be hesitant to read any more by Matt Haig, because I've read 2 of his books now, and both of them fell short for me. So the next book I read in April was Antisocial by Nick Pettigrew. He is a community local authority worker, basically working with antisocial people in council properties, rented properties, that sort of thing. So he works to solve people's problems with neighbours, antisocial behaviour, all that sort of encompasses that, really. I did find this interesting. I did give it 3 stars, which for me, it means it was a good book, but I'm not necessarily going to read it again. And this actually, with the last book, has gone straight onto, you know, my pile to give away or to donate. I did like this book. I flew through it pretty quickly. It basically follows his year as being this community authority worker, and they're separated up into each month. But overall, it shows his decline in his mental health, and it highlights a lot of the injustices and everything that can be sort of wrong with housing today, especially, you know, rented accommodation, council owned properties, that sort of thing. So I did enjoy it. Obviously I'm always fascinated by knowing about people's lives and jobs that things that give you an insight into people's jobs, whether it be, you know, ambulance workers or people that work for the council, people that work in prisons. I'm fascinated by all that sort of stuff, and I usually read a lot of those sort of books, and I have done. So yeah, it is a memoir on sort of a year in his life. On the back it says hysterically funny. I personally didn't find it like laugh out loud funny. There maybe were some times where I would like tutter to myself and be like, oh, that's quite amusing, but I wouldn't say it's hilariously funny. I probably enjoyed this more than The Midnight Library, so this probably should have scored like a 3.5. From there, we sort of started off with like a bad month, because then I read Phone Box at the Edge of the World. This is by Laura Ime Messina. This is a Japanese book. It has been translated, and this is about a telephone box that sits in one of the outside proverbs of Japan, I believe. It is based on a real place, and it is a place where you can go, and it basically has a disconnected phone, and people go there to talk to loved ones that have passed away. And this follows a woman who loses her mother and her daughter in the tsunami in 2019, I want to say. I think the story itself is fictional, but what it's based on, the tsunami, the actual telephone box, is real. So she loses her mother and daughter, and she's heard of this telephone box, and she sets off towards it. She ends up meeting a guy there who I actually thought was a lot older, but obviously the age gap wasn't that much different. He goes and visits his wife who had passed away in that tsunami, so they have this connection together. The main woman, called Yui, I believe, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name, she doesn't actually speak to, like, she goes there each time, like her and this guy called Takeshi, they go quite frequently to start with, and then sort of like every year. He always goes in the telephone box, but she never does, sort of until towards the end of the book. I did only give this 2 stars, and I think it was, again, those sort of, my expectations were maybe too high for this book, or higher than I should have put them. Because, again, I thought the actual story of it was really fascinating. Thought that there's this box there that people go and sort of talk to their loved ones. I think it was sort of the story itself and how it was maybe written just didn't excite me as much. I think I would have preferred it to have a lot like greater, deeper story to it, as far as like the characters go. For me, sort of just the characters they weren't deep enough for me, I guess, and I wasn't that invested in the characters. These first 3 books were pretty like low on my page, unfortunately, but then we switched around a bit and things got a whole lot better. I then read this. This is The Short Second Life of Brie Tanner. What a throwback this was. So I think I said in March I got quite a few free Twilight books. I got the first 3 and this one off a local like donate page. This is what they call 3.5 in the series. This is a novella to the 3rd book, Eclipse, and it follows the very short life of Brie Tanner. So if you've not watched the films, you obviously know Twilight, like everyone knows Twilight, but Brie Tanner arises in the 3rd book, and we only see her very shortly, but she is brought in as one of the new vampires. So this whole book is told by Brie's point of view, which I found fascinating, because before, you know, I haven't read Midnight Sun, which is obviously from Edward's point of view, but before this we've only ever heard from Bella's point of view of being a vampire, which is extremely different from majority of the vampires in the Twilight world. And so it was really interesting to see a very early on account of Brie. She's obviously fairly new still to becoming a vampire. She's still in that really thirsty, hungry phase, and it follows her and these other people that have been brought together, become vampires, to be an army as such. And if you've seen Twilight and Eclipse, then you know that there is sort of a fight scene in the 3rd one between the Cullens and this new vampire army. You see Brie finding a new friendship with another vampire called Diego, which is sort of short-lived. I mean, the whole book itself is quite short. But yeah, like I said, I just found it really interesting to not only get back into the Twilight world, but to see it from an authentic, newborn point of view from a vampire. And needless to say, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. And then the next book I read, very, very different. This is The Keeper of the Lost Things by Ruth Hogan. Again, I think this was one that I picked up in Tesco. A lot of these books tend to be. And I again gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This follows, well, it starts off by following a old gentleman called Anthony, and he spent majority of his life finding lost objects and then keeping them in the hopes of one day being able to reunite them back with their owners. He very early on in his life lost what was going to be his wife. They had a house together, but I believe they didn't end up getting married. She ended up dying, and on the day she died, he ended up losing this sort of like little, it's not like an amulet, but I guess like a medal or pendant that his wife gave her. And on the day he lost his wife, he also lost this pendant, and that sort of sparked him of this hope, you know, that one day he'd be reunited with this pendant, but also he could help reunite other people's lost objects as well. So that's where it starts off, and we are also introduced to his housekeeper called Laura. And when Anthony dies, he leaves all his possessions, his house, everything, all his income from books that he's written to Laura, and she's in a very sort of troubled time of her life. She doesn't really know what to do. She's split up from her husband, and she's been out of work for many years. She doesn't really know where she fits in life, and she moves into Anthony's house, and she befriends the little girl. Well, she's not little, she's 19, but she befriends this girl that lives across the road, and she also befriends the gardener that used to work for Anthony. And it follows her journey with deciding what to do with her life. In Anthony's will, he said he wanted Laura to carry on the journey of trying to reunite all these items with their lost people, and so she's struggling with the idea of how she's going to do that, and she sort of turns to the gardener and her friend Sunshine to help her work things out. She's also sort of struggling with the fact that she thinks Anthony's wife is still sort of haunting the house. She doesn't quite know why, or why she's maybe targeting Laura. I thought this had some really good description, like I could really put myself into this old English cottage with beautiful garden, beautiful like roses, and I could just picture the decoration and all these like little antique pieces around the house and his like garden room. I just could picture it really, really well, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. I really got into it, unlike with some of the others I read this past month. There is also sort of a sub-plot line which goes back to the 1970s with a girl called Eugenie, I believe. No, Eunice is her name, and so it goes back to the 1970s. Eunice is working with this guy, and it sort of follows their time in the office together. They run a publishing company, and so you obviously think, well, how does this subplot link with Anthony and Laura's life? You're thinking obviously maybe he was a published author, so maybe that coincides, and obviously as the book goes on we find out more and more about how these sort of interlink. But I did enjoy that subplot line in its own. It just sort of was very different to, you know, Laura and Anthony. You sort of have to just persevere with it and go with it, in the hopes that towards the end they sort of give you that link that matches the two. Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was really nice, really unique idea, very lovely ending, and yeah, that's all I've got to say about this one. And then the last book I read was this one. This is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. Apologies for that. Again, this is another sort of Japanese author. I actually picked up the second book, not realising at the start of April, and was like, oh, I need to actually buy the first book. So this is the first book. I've actually already finished the second book, so if that doesn't tell you this is a 5-star book, I don't know what will. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I was hesitant going in because obviously I'd read a Japanese translated book earlier in the month and didn't really like it, so I was hesitant. I was thinking, well, maybe translated Japanese books aren't for me, but I persevered, and actually I really, once I got into it, like after the first like 20 pages or so, I really got into it, and I flew through this book. I flew through the second book even quicker, but you'll have to wait for next month's review to see what I thought of that. Because I finished this literally the last day of April. So this is obviously set in Japan, and it's about a little side street cafe that you can go to, and obviously they serve coffee in that, but they also have one seat where you can sit there and you can go back in time. You can also go into the future, but mainly people go back in time to meet a loved one, someone they knew. There are a lot of rules that surround this. So the seat itself is occupied pretty much most of the day by this ghostly woman. And she gets up once a day, they don't know when, to go to the toilet. When she leaves that chair, that is when someone can go and sit on that chair and they can go back to the past or the future. So there are quite a few like conditions. They can go back to the past, but they will only see people that have visited that cafe. They cannot change what has happened after that. They can't change the present. So if someone died 2 months after that encounter and they manage to tell them something that stops that, they'll still find a way for that person to die, if you see what I mean. They can't change if they can't change what is in the present day. The main rule is you are only allowed to be there for as long as the coffee stays warm. Once the coffee gets cold, then that is your time to return. You have to return and drink the coffee before it gets cold. If you don't, you can stay in that world and you become that ghost. You replace that woman that is sat there. Which is something that we sort of find out as we go in. So yeah, this is set into what I would say 4 chapters. They're sort of like 4 mini stories. Each one follows a character, and throughout we have like the staff character that work in the cafe. They go through the first book and the second, but we are introduced to different people throughout the 4 stories. Usually everything sort of interlinks in some way. Like we will see just a random person, for instance, come in the first story, and when we get to the 3rd story we find out that later on they've revisited the cafe and gone back in the past. I think this has such a unique idea, and like I said, I really enjoyed it. I thought the stories themselves had a lot of emotion to them and a lot of meaning. From this I sort of gathered that like the fable, you know how there's always like something to take away from it. From this I sort of thought that like, yes, you can go back into the past, you can revisit things over and over again, but it's not going to change the present, but it will change your perspective on the future and how you go about things and your attitude towards things that will happen in the future. So that's what I sort of took away from this. I did find this had quite a repetitive structure. I didn't mind it so much, but I could sort of predict how it was going to go. So you're introduced to sort of the cafe staff, and then you sort of get introduced to the new character who you suspect straight away is the one that's going to go back into the past or the future, and they sort of interact with the coffee staff, and then it follows them sitting in the chair preparing for going back in time, and then you find out a little bit more about them and the person that they want to meet when they go back in time, and then it follows on from them meeting that person and then coming back into present day. So it has a fairly simple repetitive structure, which I didn't mind. I thought it was quite a nice structure, so why change it? I think the cover itself is really, really pretty. Like I said, I picked up the second book in Waterstones and had to get the first book on Amazon. The second one is signed, which I thought was very exciting. I'm pleased that I ended up liking this book. It restored my faith in reading like translated books, I guess, and especially Japanese ones, because I think Japanese people have such a different culture to ours as well. One thing to sort of get your head around is there are a lot of names that start with the letter K. So many. Like K's and F's seem to be really like present. K's, F's and H's, so it can be sometimes a little bit confusing. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a really super unique idea, and yeah, I would very much recommend this one. This and these 2 I guess are my top 2 of the month as far as new books go. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed seeing this video. Let me know down below if you plan on reading any of these, if you're going to add them to your TBR list. As always, my Goodreads is down below so you can see what I'm reading, you know, like in real time. And yeah, I will see you very soon. Bye guys.